because we need to reinforce the disciplinary mechanisms by which the population is willing to go sell its labor power for a low wage, right? The healthy labor markets for economists mean that people will accept lower wages, will accept, as the motto of austerity was originally constructed in the years I look at after the First World War, will accept to consume less and produce more.
On the British point, by the way, in India, we are seeing I mean, it's an insanity of sort of celebration about a conservative MP becoming the prime minister, because this is the first Indian to become the prime minister of a white nation, as if 200 years of colonialism was just undone by Rishi Sunak coming to power. But
is actually asking the question, is fascism back in Italy, right? Is it back? And my answer would be not quite yet.
hello and welcome. Today we have a very special guest with us, Clara Mattei. Clara is an Italian assistant professor in the economics department of the New School for Social Research, New York. Her research contributes to history of capitalism, exploring the critical relation between economic ideas and technocratic policymaking. Her book, entitled The Capital Order: How Economists Invented Austerity and Paved the Way to Fascism, is just about to be released. We are privileged to have her discuss the book with us. Clara, welcome to Indian Global Left.
Thank you for this invitation. I'm very excited to be here with you.
Great. So and thanks for sharing the draft of the book. I mean, this is one great thing of having a show like this. A few months ago, Norman Finkelstein, he shared his book with us before the release, and we had a nice discussion about that. But anyway, I like to begin with a short commentary on the book, but in the interest of time, I would not do that. But I must say this, that your book is very well written. I actually read the book in one sitting in 9 hours, because my team said that you cannot postpone it anymore, so I could just go through. It's very well written. There is a great connection from one chapter to another, so the structure is great, but also the language. I must say that there is no intellectual gymnastics there, which is very important for those of us whose audience is not just university intellectuals. So that's a sort of side note to begin with. The first, I think this is a good entry point into the book. A lot of what your book deals with is typically what we understand by the word neoliberalism. Now, I'm not really inclined to give up the word entirely, because it has now become some political significance where you can expose, rapacious capitalism by the usage of that word. But neoliberalism as an analytic category is a bit hazy. Instead, what you use, austerity capitalism, but by placing austerity at the center of capitalism, it gives us much greater depth and analytical understanding. So that's one. And secondly, our conventional understanding of austerity is generally the fiscal austerity, and you can tie to that the industrial austerity. And we are complicit in believing, sometimes inadvertently, that monetary policy is somehow run by the central bank and somewhat independent of the state, which your work shows is a mistake. And instead, it's much better to see conservative monetary policy and both fiscal and industrial austerity in conjunction as a tool to give more stability to rapacious capitalism. So why not start by you explaining this thesis of austerity to our viewers?
Yes. Okay. One word about why I try to move away from using too much of the word neoliberalism. It's because I feel that politically, what happens is that if one focuses on neoliberalism, it appears as if neoliberalism is the exception, a phase of capitalism that potentially can be written off so as to go back to a virtuous form of capitalism, right? And so the idea that there is such a thing as a Keynesian capitalism that is very different from neoliberal capitalism. And so what should progressives do today? Well, let's just go back and think about how great it was when we had the New Deal, a Green New Deal, a new Bretton Woods. This, in a way, gets us stuck in the problem that we're not really understanding how capitalism really functions, and the fact that capitalism has some structural limits to it and what can be done. And this is why austerity fundamentally is cardinal to capitalism, because really capitalism can only run smoothly if austerity is put into place. And this is something we are clearly seeing today when, with inflation mounting, even Keynesians have as the recipe going back to austerity, right? So we see that in the moments in which capitalism is in crisis, both because of monetary instability, but also because of political contestation. We know that in the United States, but not just in the United States, there is the phenomenon of the great resignation. People are just sick about going out and selling their labor power for a low wage and precarious conditions. And thus, there is a really instability of the fundamental social relation that preserves our system. And this is something that also can only be really fixed with austerity, right? So we see now that the policies we're seeing around the globe, including monetary austerity, right? So the hikes in interest rates that are happening also in India today, the repo rates, right, of the Central Bank of India are constantly being increased. I think they're at 5.9% right now. Mm-hmm. We know ECB is increasing them this week, the Fed. The point being here is that if you are stuck in the idea that there is such a thing as a Keynesian virtuous way out of let's say neoliberalism, then we can't really figure out why everyone is unanimously saying we need to inflict some pain in order to get back to our fundamentals, right? Mm-hmm. And so we can really understand the rationality, the political reasons why high interest rates are necessary right now, because we need to reinforce the disciplinary mechanisms by which the population is willing to go sell its labor power for a low wage, right? The healthy labor markets for economists mean that people will accept lower wages, will accept, as the motto of austerity was originally constructed in the years I look at after the First World War, will accept to consume less and produce more, right? And this we're seeing in practice because I was listening to the Financial Times update this morning. In fact, consumer demand is going down, right? So we are cooling off the economy. How? Because people now are constrained. They can no longer consume as much, and they will be forced to go back and work at lower wages once unemployment starts to soar. And again, in the United States, we see that economists are saying very explicitly, that's the thing, it's not really hidden anywhere, it's just put in technical jargon, which really is telling us a very hard truth, which is the fact that unemployment has to be higher than what it is in order for people to be disciplined within the capital order and for economic growth to start coming up again. So in a way, the point here is that the recession is a short-term loss for a much longer term and structural gain, which is the preservation of the capital order, as the title of the book. By capital meaning the social relation of production, of people selling their labor power in return for a wage that has to be uniform across a society in order for capitalism to be secured. So I think this is very important. And I think that the problem with just focusing on neoliberalism is that you kind of miss the structural critique to capitalism as such. And especially nowadays in which we see all economists agreeing, from Keynesians to less Keynesians, we need to ask why. Just a side note about, again, I think how timely, unfortunately, this book is that not only we see interest rates hikes everywhere, of course, in reaction again to labor struggles, because also in India, I was trying to inform myself a little bit more about what is happening in your country. And we know that even last March, right, you guys had millions, almost 200 million people out on strike in 2022. So we need to, and this goes to your second point that you were pointing to, is that we cannot separate monetary policy from industrial relations, from workers' relations, from the social relations of production. This is another typical trait of what economists do, to depoliticize what they're doing. So we kind of think about monetary policy issues as separable from what goes on in the workplace, in the social relations that govern our society. Well, it's not the case, because there's a clear connection between worker militancy, also in India, and what the Modi government is doing, what Powell is doing, what the head of the ECB is doing. And very unfortunately, we see that this is everywhere, really. So I just wanted to point to the fact that there was a great chart book of Adam Tooze that just came out last week, and I follow him closely. He has always very interesting material out there. And he was talking about this report of the Center for Economic Policy Research. They wrote this, and this is like, it's a group of stellar economists, specifically European and American, and they wrote this macroeconomic policies for wartime Ukraine. Okay, so they wrote a report on advices of what Ukraine should do now that it's in this dire economic situation. Okay, Ukraine is a country right now in which nominal wages have been cut in almost half the firms, and in many sectors by 50%. There's millions of workers that are being dismissed from their works. Of course, we also have the problem of people being displaced. And these economists are saying, well, you know what, tough luck. What should Ukraine do at the moment? Austerity. How do they call it? They say deregulation. They call for greater labor flexibility. And this is in line with what Zelensky actually is doing during the war effort. He silently in August signed a law that actually took away the protection of the labor law that made it such that workers could not just be dismissed from one minute to another. He basically flexibilized the labor market with passing this law during the war effort. So once more, we're seeing this everywhere around the globe.
Right.
And, yes, and
Go
sorry,
on.
to complete what you were asking me, because I went on a tangent a little. Monetary policies, interest rates hikes have to be looked at in combination with fiscal cuts. And so the fiscal side of austerity, and again, it's not about just cutting budgets in general, right? If you just look at the deficit spending, if the deficit spending of a country, if the deficit of a country is high, it doesn't necessarily mean that austerity is not being done, right? Because it depends where you spend. Right. And where you cut, because
also taxation can be low and deficit can still be high.
Absolutely. So what we see is, for example, right now in Italy, we are spending a ton of money in military expenditures to send to NATO, but we are cutting on a lot of essential services, redistributive services, right? So that's still austerity, even if spending is not in the aggregate going down. And the same as what we are seeing also with what Liz Truss was trying to do, and I'm sure Sunak will do just more silently, which is cut taxes at the top, which of course is going to decrease the revenue of the state. And so, you know, you don't see this as cutting the debt, but it's actually austerity, right? Because austerity, it's about where you decide to spend and where you decide to cut. You need to see how it's redistributive, how in a way the fiscal measures serve as a redistributive means. And what we've seen historically, starting from the years I describe in my book, is that austerity has always been about transferring resources from the majority to a minority, okay? It's a structural transfer of resources that can be done through cutting social spending, but also through increasing consumption taxes, right? So this is clearly something that Rishi Sunak is going to do now that he's Prime Minister in the UK. We need to think about the fact that Rishi Sunak, of course, is the first Indian MP, but he's also the richest. He's a multimillionaire. He's richer than the royal family. So it's actually the first time historically this happened. So again, we need to keep the class dimension at the top to understand what's going on. And it's about what classes gain and what classes don't gain. So monetary austerity, fiscal austerity, but also what I call industrial austerity. And industrial austerity is fundamentally all what everything that involves what happens around the relations of production. So what's the relation with unions? So cutting union benefits, wage repression, but also very importantly, privatization. Okay, the fact that you are subjugating people more and more to the impersonal laws of the market. So you need to cut public employment, okay? And this is something that economists have no trouble, mainstream economists have no trouble saying. Someone like Alberto Alesina, who passed away not too long ago, he was very famous for saying, for example, that in the south of Italy, he has a lot of very prestigious technical papers saying that south of Italy suffers from the culture of dependence because there's too much public employees. So what do we need to do? These public employees are too entitled. So the problem here is that we need to privatize so that these public employees will be forced to accept a lower reservation wage. And he says it very explicitly, again, using very technical jargon, but there's no hidden agenda there. It's very clear that in order for economic growth to work properly, so for the GDP of Italy to grow, workers need to be paid less and be disciplined by the impersonal laws of the market.
This reminds me of what Adam Smith was almost suggesting for economic efficiency. He said that countries should do where they are efficient. So this means industrial Britain would be the more advanced form of capital-driven economy. And then he suggested that countries like, let's say, Africa or India should do what it is good at. That's the competitive advantage. So serve labor. And that's the sort of relation between north and south of Italy. So, deregulate labor in the south so that capital in the north can consume more. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot there. I don't want to spend time by responding to those things. I would just say that with the war in Ukraine, there is a huge drive towards neoliberalization of Ukraine and binding Ukraine more tightly into not just the NATO-led military world order, but also the sort of IMF World Bank-led neoliberal world order. So that's one. And on the export of monetary austerity, things have become much easier now because of the how connected the global world is and the dominance of dollar. So the problem is the Fed hikes the interest rate, and then emerging economies are left with very hard choice because the currencies are already floated, and if you don't hike interest rates, then your exchange rate goes. And you cannot put restrictions because your whole economy is deregulated anyway. So it's sort of a huge mess. But anyway, let's enter the book because one of the, and you suggested the critical importance of your work is to show that neoliberalism or austerity capitalism is not something that came out in the 80s, because a lot of our conventional understanding has to do with what happened in the United States and the economic theories that come out of it, that somehow it was the 80s when these tools were devised. You, on the other hand, take us back to the First World War and show that there were these contestations, the external shock, even though the fruits of collective labor were shared more by capital, but it did create a sort of regulatory framework on which the workers mounted their struggle right after the war, and that created real possibilities from different directions to which we'll come to. So tell us the importance of the First World War and how it sort of gives us a handle to have a long view of neoliberalism or austerity capitalism, as you like, and in many ways decenter America from the whole story, because you are taking us back to Europe in many ways.
Yes, and before I begin, I would like to say that, of course, my book focuses on Italy and Britain because those countries were in those years experiencing, in fact, democratization of the economy. There was a sense by which people had gained entitlement, political entitlement, in the very formal sense that the suffrage had increased, right? So people could go vote. In Britain, it was the first time that there was basically universal male suffrage, and also women with a certain amount of property could vote as well. So the reason why I focus on these countries is because they are countries in which, if we understand austerity as a tool of reaction, austerity was a tool of reaction in political settings where people had gained political entitlements, right? So austerity had always been structurally there even before the First World War. Okay, it was austere capitalism was just how capitalism was run, right? From the comparative advantage of Ricardo to just the way the gold standard functioned.
That's the classical
right, exactly.
Yeah.
But the point is that I want to make is that austerity becomes visible once the foundation of capitalism are contested. Okay, so this is why the same book could have been written to look at what was going on in many different countries of the world, right? Because of course I take away the attention from the United States, even if the United States are part of the story. And especially going back to what you were saying a minute ago, the United States were enforcing austerity after the First World War themselves. So this put pressure on Britain to increase interest rates even more in order to, in fact, keep the pegging of the gold to a certain amount, right? So again, the combination, of course, countries, I focus on the internal class struggle, but you cannot take away the focus also from international relations and the connection. It was already a global economy, right? And what countries were doing. And of course, we could have told the story what was happening in the empires and in the south of the globe, and it would have been just as interesting. But the reality was that those countries were still, in a way, more subjugated politically, rather. So the revolutionary spirits were emerging in Europe. That's why I'm focusing there. But this doesn't mean that the story can only be told from this perspective, right? So what happens in Europe, especially given that the war is played out in Europe, is that there is a large what I called a repoliticization of the pillars of capitalism. And by pillars of capitalism, I'm talking about wage relations and the private property of the means of production. Here, what happens is that the state, in order to win the conflict, has to massively intervene in spheres in which before it was, in fact, leaving it to the free impersonal market forces. This makes it such that instead of seeing the state as, a virtuous, friendly, neutral actor, the workers were realizing that the state was a hugely exploitative force. Actually, in a moment in which the market would have made it such that workers would have been less exploited. Why? Because when you are in a war, a lot of people have to go fight the war in the trenches, okay, First World War, and there was less labor force available. So laws of supply and demand, there was less supply of labor and there was a lot of demand for labor because production had boosted immensely to fight the war, right? And workers would have had to get paid better, and they had the upper hand in that historical moment. So there we had the urge of state intervention to force the workers to work, right? So actually in Italy, it got really bad to the point that the workforce was militarized, meaning that they had to like basically behave according to the same code as the military. And if they didn't show up to work, they could be jailed and basically considered traitors of the nation, okay? Same happened in Britain in less direct forms, but the leaving certificates were basically that were very contested by the unions were these certificates that made it such that the employer had to give you a certificate in order for you to go work somewhere else. By the way, something that we still see today, very obviously with the whole discussion about monopsony and what happens in big corporations in the United States, you cannot freely change your work spot place. And this is because, of course, it's a way to kill the bargaining power of the workers. So it's all forms that we're still seeing today, nothing really new. But in that historical moment, the point is that workers felt the urge to break away from capitalism. And what I do in my book is go through a lot of experiments, practical and theoretical experiments of how workers were imagining a different society, okay? And so guild socialism, we had a lot of plans for self-management of production, worker council movements, and all throughout even more reformist measures. Anyway, the point is that capitalism was in turmoil and the bourgeoisie was scared. And again, it's something that we still see today, is that the dominant classes very well know that this system we're in is not fixed, is not eternal. So what's interesting here, and this is something that, of course, someone like Marx saw immediately, is that you need to construct an ideology which is part and parcel of austerity, by which the system is indeed eternal and natural and impossible to escape. But the reality is that the dominant classes know that actually capitalism is quite of a historical system that can change and evolve. And it was so obvious at that moment because there was a Russian Revolution that just happened. There was the whole Eastern Europe that was in flux. And this was also the case in the very heart of the West, in Britain, the cradle of advanced capitalism. So more than ever in this moment, economic experts played a huge role in refurbishing the capital order, restabilizing something that had been shaken. And how do you do it if not with the best idea of finding a group of experts that can portray themselves as above parts, above class conflict, having theory that actually is just the truth that everyone has to abide by, right? So this is the key to how consensus is maintained for the system we're in. And we clearly see it still today. I would just like to remind you guys, given that Sunak was just elected in office a couple of days ago, that he resigned from Boris Johnson's government with a letter of resignation that if you put in my book, you would not see the difference between his wording and the wording the experts were using in the Brussels Financial Conference of 1920 and Genoa 1922, okay? This is what he says in this resignation letter that you can find online, okay? He says, we both want a low-tax, high-growth economy and world-class public services. But this can only be reasonably delivered if we are prepared to work hard, make sacrifices, and take difficult decisions. I firmly believe the public are ready to hear that truth. People need to know that whilst there's a path to a better future, it is not an easy one. This rhetoric of hard truth, then the fact that everyone should just accept to make sacrifice for the good of the whole, is exactly the austerity rhetoric that was basically for the first time wielded and refined after the First World War. So consume less, produce more. This is a hard truth. It's us experts. We're telling you what to do, and you just need to accept it. And of course, there's a whole bunch of sophisticated economic theory backing it. We have to not forget that the marginalist framework, which is the foundation of neoclassical theory today, comes exactly from the end of the 19th century, and it was diffusing at the time of the years I look at, so the 20s and 30s. And here the whole point was that you would create a theoretical framework that not only would tell you this is true theory without any political bias, it's also theory that clearly tells you the engine of the machine is no longer the worker, it is the entrepreneur, and anyone can become entrepreneur. So you see how intelligent this is. If you expel class conflict from the model, then it means that there's only individuals and there's potential harmony, right? Our capitalist system is not a system of conflict, it is a system of social order and harmony, in which if one benefits, all others do. And we can all potentially be virtuous economic agents. We can all potentially be homo economici. And whoever makes it at the top, it means he deserves it. He or she deserves it. And if you don't, it means you're lazy. So if you go look at their theory and what they're writing on the newspaper, these experts that I tell the story about in my book, you see that in their models, they're saying, you know, the virtuous agent has a very low subjective discount rate, meaning that they can save without suffering too much, right? They can actually endure sacrifice easier. Then what they're writing on the press at the same exact moment is that workers are like pigs that go at the tavern and waste everything in wine and women. So, okay, and they eat just too many biscuits and just consume too much alcohol. Okay, these are the same experts that use these very different, we can say, very different, I can't think of the word, but anyway, they use just a different way of expressing themselves, but basically it's all coherent in their framework, right? High theory is just a way to justify some very classist beliefs that they can elevate to something that seems that is for the good of the whole.
In fact, one of the central points that you make is that as capitalism faces this enormous crisis from the labor movement, the militant labor movement on one side, and the more sort of reformist labor having coalition with the reconstructivist, which is, for the easier word, is the welfarist, for those statesmen and professional class and politicians in Britain and in Italy and in many other places who, after the First World War, believed that the sort of rapacious predatory capitalism was not acceptable. So these two challenges were mounted on capitalism. And to break out of that challenge, you say that one way was fascism, which is the later part of your book, which is sort of pure coercion, but a significant part with it is technocracy, that economic experts coming out and peddling theories, normalizing it as if this is a science which lies literally outside human reality, and so you'd have to accept it. It's a great thesis. And on your point that there is a global story to the story you said, I firmly believe in it, because if you look at the United States, for instance, 1919, the greatest ever waves of strikes across the northeastern and the eastern belt. I think 4 million, if my memory serves right, more than 4 million workers were involved in those strikes. Of course, they were defeated because they were very divided internally. Native white Americans versus the more newly immigrant white Americans, black versus whites, skilled, unskilled, and so on. And it takes them a decade to overcome some of those barriers and the shock of the Great Depression to come organized in the 1930s. But even in places like India, for instance, during the First World War and soon after that, arrangements for federal level unionization, the Indian National Congress, which was the leading sort of movement that was driving anti-colonialism, floats its own party for the first time in 1919, and this was part of the larger civil disobedience movement, which is also called the non-cooperation movement. But there are similar stories in Shanghai and so on. Let's not get there. I want to return to Italy for the very simple fact that this revolutionary upsurge in the last years of the First World War and up to 1920, we generally have the Soviet Union in mind, at best the Soviet formation in Hungary or Bavaria, and on the other end would be the heroic minor struggle in Britain. But Italy sort of, I think, from what I remember of your book, you say that apart from the Soviet experiments in Russia and in Hungary, the worker councils movement and its first Occupy factory movement, it's not the Occupy Wall Street, but the Occupy factory movement was, you said, the most revolutionary after the formation of the Soviets. And so just to bring that back to our memory, because there is a lot of collective amnesia, can you tell us a little bit? And also with that, because you focus so much on discourses and how Gramsci and Togliatti and his comrades came up with these alternative frameworks that challenge the more hegemonic framework.
Yes, there's so much to say here. Also, I want to add some stuff, comments of what you said before this, but let's start with this. Definitely. So to the collective memory, I'm from Turin. So of course, there's also an attachment, a physical and emotional attachment to the city, and that is very central to my story. So Gramsci, who we know for the prison notebooks, people usually lose sight of the fact that the reason why, and this actually, we were discussing this with Richard Wolff the other day, gave a talk for us. The reason
he came
why
on our show.
I know. That's why I'm saying
for our viewers who haven't watched that. But anyway,
I absolutely know that he came to your show. But the reason why Gramsci was able to do such high theory in his prison notebooks was because he was engaging in concrete militancy. Starting from the years of the war, in which he was actually one of the exponents of the Socialist Party, all the way to being one of the founders of the famous Ordine Nuovo movement, the movement for the new order, in which he directly was engaged in battling for workers' councils with workers themselves. Okay, so this is why he embodies the concept of praxis that is so important still for us today to defeat the ruling ideology of austerity. Praxis meaning that theory and action are deeply intertwined. So action is thought and thought is action, as Gramsci would put it. This means that you can really only subvert how we think about our system if we start changing how we act within our system. And this is why the council movement was really a factor of both of these elements, because they were concretely engaged in different relations of production. So they had assemblies in order to actually experiment with direct economic democracy, meaning that it's actually about all being producers. Okay, no more class hierarchies. We are all producers and we need to do this democratically. And at the same time, L'Ordine Nuovo had a newspaper in which, I did a lot of research. I read all through their amazing issues. Okay, so you can find them online. They're in Italian, unfortunately, but in my book, you find a lot of translation of what I feel are like very important conceptual spaces that are opened up in this magazine, in which, in fact, they're thinking collectively as they're acting collectively, and what they're experimenting with is workers' agency. So stop thinking that theory can only come from the experts, only come from people who are more educated than you. But these workers were being re-empowered and thinking, no, we can theorize about our own social order. We don't need the expert out there to tell us what to do. And plus, the expert out there has a conception of economic freedom that is the opposite of our conception of emancipation from the capital relation that enslaves us. Okay, if you think about the fact that these experts were trying to reimpose market freedom, and by market freedom, they meant the freedom of the savior investor to do what they wanted with the commodities, the workers were exactly thinking in completely different conceptual terms. So this, and you can read more. I don't want to go too much in the details because there's my book there and I hope you read it. It's chapter 4.
I've read the full book.
Yeah. No, I know, not you. I'm saying the general
viewers.
audience.
Yes,
No, I know.
Everyone
Otherwise,
should.
You wouldn't have asked me this question otherwise. So absolutely important to look at the Ordine Nuovo movement as an experiment that is still speaking to us today, because this is the point of this book. I'm trying to write something that is historical, but can have a lot of insights for the present moment, okay? And as in the present moment, though, the insight is also watch out, because the reason why I focus on Italy and Britain is exactly because I want to show that even with different degrees of workers' empowerment in these two countries, and a lot of similarities, by the way, L'Ordine Nuovo was inspired by the British shop steward movement, was writing down what Lenin was saying in Russia. Rosa Luxemburg was writing pieces. They were, in fact, putting ideas together at an international level and writing it for the Italian workers. What you see is that the reaction is similar, actually very disquieting, very scaringly so, between a democratic setting, parliamentary Britain, liberal parliamentary Britain, and authoritarian, just born fascist dictatorship in Italy. Okay, so that's the reason why I also pick these two countries, is to say, hey, look, in the most different, what in our mind are the most
different,
what in our mind, and again, it's something that we are learned to think in this, we learn to think in this way. What is more distant than fascism and liberalism? They're completely opposing ideologies, completely different worlds. Actually, if you go and look historically at the origins of how fascism came to power and how it justified its power, you see that the best allies of fascist militias and of the Duce were the liberal economic experts. And both in Italy, and Luigi Einaudi, who then becomes our first president of the Republic after Mussolini is killed and defeated after the Second World War, Luigi Einaudi, who becomes our, and now everyone is celebrating Einaudi as a great anti-fascist. Einaudi, throughout the whole of the 1920s, and this is a lot I have in the book about Einaudi, supported fascism. Why? Because fascism was the best student of austerity. You needed a strong government to really defeat this turbulent Italian population, people were not consuming, they were consuming too much, working too little. They were demanding for rights that were unacceptable if we want to keep capitalism alive. Thus, we needed to reimpose capitalism as a social order. And liberals were saying very explicitly, I have all these quotes from the archives, okay? This is not, this work is of theory, but it's based on archival material. So you go and you read Montagu Norman from the Bank of England, all the liberals in Italy, and Churchill, they're saying, listen, you know, the only way to do it in Italy is through a fascist government. We know there's tortures, we know there's killings, we know there's no freedom of press, but this is how the Italians should do it. I can read you a quote immediately because they have so many. Montagu Norman, right, the head of the Bank of England, was very well saying, here it is, one sec. Fascism has surely brought order out of chaos over the last few years. Something of the kind was no doubt needed if the pendulum was not to swing too far in quite the other direction. The Duce was the right man at a critical moment. This is Montagu Norman to to Jack Morgan, so Montagu Norman to Jack Morgan of the Morgan Chase in 1926. So the Duce had been in power already since 1922 at that point. So very important for me to show not only, so this is important, not only was fascism supported by liberalism in Italy, okay, and the fact that fascism could directly use the power of the state to suppress unions, so it outlawed unions, it outlawed strikes, it directly suppressed wages by law, okay, in order to refurbish profits and impose industrial peace, okay, plus doing horrible cuts in social spending. For the going back to the gold standard, they increased interest rate, deflated the economy, and all of that. The same policies were also being done in Britain to their own citizens, okay? And you did not need there to have a strong state a la Mussolini, because you could use the dials of the macroeconomic management, what we're seeing right now today.
Technocracy was much more efficient.
The technocracy was much more efficient. Absolutely. The divide between the economic and the political was more established. And it's the truth also today, right? So this is a point you made earlier on. So I want to stress it in what you were saying before, is that technocracy is just as repressive and authoritarian in wielding the power of the expert against its own people, right? Than a fascist dictatorship. Okay,
and much more effective.
Much more effective, because it's able to preserve greater consensus. It's more hypocritical, right? Because it's able to pretend there is a much more freedom. And so in my chapter, I have chapter 9 of the book is actually very good in showing also some stylized facts of how the workers were defeated. And what you see is that the wage share, which had gone up, right? The wage share is that the whole of the GDP goes to wages instead of to profits. And while the wage share had gone up massively during the years of the Red Biennium, right? The Red years of 1918, 1919, 1920, they massively go down in the 1920s, both in Britain and in Italy, okay? And so here I would like to point out to the fact that, again, how much a recession can play the game that in another country like Italy was played by Mussolini's castor oil, okay? And this is something that is clearly understood, for example, by someone like G.D.H. Cole, who was a guild socialist at the time, and he has this important quote that I would really like to read, in which he really pinpoints to the rationality of austerity. Why austerity is not bad theory. Austerity is very rational in what it's doing. He says the big work, so he's describing what happens after so there's a huge interest rate hike in 1920, 1921. And by 1922, there's a recession in Britain. And he says the big working class offensive had been successfully stalled off, and British capitalism, though threatened with economic adversity, felt itself once more safely in the saddle and well able to cope both industrially and politically with any attempt that might still be made from the labor side to unseat it. Okay, so a clear understanding that we have an economic cost to a much greater end. And last point, sorry, I'm so excited, there's so much to say, and last point in this direction is to fully understand technocracy, is to understand in Britain the importance of an independent central bank. So when I talk about technocracy in my book, I try to conceptualize it as being fundamentally two things. One is what I just talked about a minute ago, which is the epistemic stance of experts being above class struggle in what they advise, okay? So the neutrality of the economic science. And once more, that's why marginalism was called pure economics in the early days, just to really mark the difference between political economy, that is what classical political economists were doing. We enter a period in which you don't talk about political economy anymore. You're talking about pure economics that then becomes economics. And of course, pure economics. And here there is another quote.
Almost like laws of nature.
Exactly. So I have a very also here good quote. So Pantaleoni was one of the founding fathers, and he was a fascist working for Mussolini, but he was also one of the most respected economists at the time, at the level of Jevons and Valra. And this is his colleague talking about him. And he says, Pantaleoni saw that there must be a theoretical part of economic science, a nucleus of doctrines that are independent of opinions, as well as of ethical, political, and religious predilections, something similar to physics and mathematics. This is pure economics, okay? So the profoundly positivist stance that the discipline takes to distance itself from social sciences. That's one aspect of technocracy. But the most important aspect, I would say, is also the fact that historically experts come to power and can make economic decisions independently from the majority. And this happens, importantly, in a moment in which the majority was asking to make economic decisions, exactly because after the war, everyone's saying, hey, we worked our asses off. We almost, we lost our lives. We lost our families. We suffered. Now we want to make choices, right? So that's why Lloyd George was saying home fit for heroes. We need to give something to the people. Well, right in that moment, there is a huge campaign in Britain about making the central bank far more independent. In a moment in which the Labour Party was thinking about nationalizing the central bank, there was Ralph Hawtrey, who was one of the protagonists of my book, who was working at the Treasury, and he's one of the founders of the concept of independent central banks. And he was saying, we need central banks so that they can be free from any criticism and from any pressure. And they can, there's this very cool quote that he says, the central bank can thus never apologize, never regret, never explain, okay? So really kind of the idea that the experts can do whatever they want. And this again is so timely if you think about what's happening in India, right? Actually, you guys had, two things about India, which are really interesting. One is that these experts that I talk about in my book, Basil Blackett, Ralph Hawtrey, and oh my goodness, it's been a while. Clearly that I'm missing the third. Anyhow, these experts were the ones.
There are 4 experts in Italy.
So there's Montagu Norman, who's the central banker, is kind of more in the background. But I have Niemeyer, who's at the Treasury, right? Sorry, that's the name I was missing.
And Hawtrey led the English.
Hawtrey was the economic, but Basil Blackett was the one who went and enforced an independent central bank upon India. Okay, so the independence of the central bank, and this is something I write in the book, but I don't dedicate my space to it. What happens is that this ideology of independent central bank is being spread around the world. So while Niemeyer goes to Brazil and basically convinces the Brazilian government to implement independent central banks, and he goes to Australia, Blackett goes to India. He works in India and actually is able to construct the independent central bank that is found in 1934. Okay, so this is a direct outcome of what's happening in the motherland, and they're imposing it on the colony, and to the point that the independent mandate in India comes from there. And still today, by the way, there was recently, you guys had a change in the constitution of the bank, and I think this was in 2016, by which fundamentally there's this monetary policy committee that now decide, right? So that now you guys have this monetary policy committee that is in charge of deciding on inflation targeting. So inflation targeting becomes again one of the mandates of the Bank of India. There's no
in fact, it was said that inflation targeting should be the core because the central bank was involved too much in, its welfareist goal.
Exactly.
Things like priority sector lending that says that the commercial banks should keep, let's say, 20% of its loan quota to agriculture. Agriculture meaning very poor agriculture at very low interest. So those things should be now, pushed aside, and the central bank should be exclusively focused on managing the currency and the inflation.
Exactly. So inflation targets of 2016, right? There's this change in the official gazette. And there's the creation a couple months after of this monetary policy committee, which is made up of 6 members. 3 are the governors fundamentally of the Bank of India. So the big bureaucrats, technocrats from the central bank. The other 3 are economic professors, and fundamentally they can decide on monetary policy independently. So this is, again, 100 years back, it's where this struggle to maintain independence of monetary issues is moved. And, it's something that Keynes, again, I want to stress, Keynes was part of these experts who were enforcing austerity in early 1920s. Then he can change his mind once the workers are defeated. But when it's about preserving the bourgeois social order, Keynes has no doubts, to the point that in 1920, he was advocating for interest rate hikes up to 8% or 10%, much higher than even someone like Ralph Hawtrey. And he tells Ralph Hawtrey, I am in deep agreement with you that central banks need to be independent. Okay, so it's very important to keep in mind that, again, there is a clear class struggle, and someone like Keynes is taking, he admits it, Keynes admits it. I'm on the side of the bourgeoisie. I want an illuminated capitalism. I'm not going to accept any breach from this social order. So this is all things to keep in mind for today when we see, again, the uniting of the so-called neoliberals and the Keynesians in a fundamental austerity framework that unites fascist liberals and so on. In Italy, now we're back to a government that is directly inspired by Mussolini. And she just hired as her Minister of Economics, someone that will be in complete continuity with the Draghi government. Draghi was an extremely technocratic government. He was able to privatize everything at the last moment. Okay, he passed insane privatization. He just ripped apart the fact that we had a referendum to try to safeguard public utilities from privatizations. And it was a very successful referendum. He just killed it, passing laws that oblige all cities to fundamentally privatize their public utilities, transportation, water. So again, cycles and recycles of history, everything that kind of emerges. But the point of the book is to look at the logic of austerity in the general function of capitalism. And the logic cannot be an abstract. It's very concrete, and it's embodied by experts, by people in the state. And again, it's a state-led policy austerity, right? It's not about the state being put in a corner. No, no, no. Austerity is about the state intervening in a classist way to shift resources from the many to the few, with the backing of an economic theory that tells you that it's the few that need protection, because it's the virtuous few that will get the machine running for everyone else for the good of the whole. So it's a deeply state-led classist project austerity. And we see it everywhere, unfortunately, still today.
Right. We can stop here, or I can ask you one final question if you have the time.
Go ahead.
Yeah. And by the way, I didn't know about this, the technocrats coming to India from the central bank. Because, I mean, India is an interesting case because Britain used to had huge sort of trade deficit with India, and there were different ways of managing that. But one of the, starting from regressive taxation too, but one of the ways was to artificially fix the exchange rate to sort of manage the huge trade deficit that it would run. And independent central bank, I would assume, would be much more helpful in doing that. But anyway, I would just leave you with this final question, which brings us back to how timely your book is. You have referred to both Britain and England and Italy, your two sort of case studies, if I may, of the book. And there is a sort of we see what went on in 10 Downing Street. I think 5 prime ministers have changed in the last 6 years in Britain. It's a very sort of the Conservative Party in itself is in crisis, and this is following a massive victory where, you know, Labour had its landslide defeat. They are unable to rule, and if a general election is now called, things are very bleak for this is despite the Corbynites being pushed out, and, you know, Keir Starmer be leading the Labour Party in a quite Blairite line. But the world is more concerned, seems to be more concerned, because Brothers of Italy, led by Sister Meloni, comes here, and people think whether we would see fascism, and many people are upset in Italy when this question is asked. My own sense is that these are not sort of, we wouldn't see brown shirters marching in the street, because they don't need it, because that sort of challenge to capital that was there in the 1920s, out of which emerged the dual experiment of technocracy, and in Italy's case, the sort of the fascist, that is not even needed, because labor is very, very weak. Italy, the massive Communist Party of Italy, once massive, just break. It just fizzled away after the 90s.
Yeah.
So what's your sense of how do you see that?
Thanks. These are all important points. So I'm trying to get an article published, but so now I haven't had success. We'll see if it gets published in the next couple of weeks. That is actually asking the question: is fascism back in Italy? Right? Is it back? And my answer would be not quite yet. And why would I say that? Is exactly because of some thoughts you just had, is that I tried to draw some parallelism and contrast and compare the today and 100 years before. Now we are about, in 2 days, there is the centenary of the March on Rome. Okay, so in 2 days, it was going to be 100 years back, Mussolini marched on Rome. And again, what I stress in the book, and also in this supposed article I hope is going to be published, is that the March on Rome was not a coup. Okay, it's seen as a coup, like the march, militarized group, all these military soldiers coming in, you know, the militia, the fascist militia coming into Rome. Mussolini was called by the king to resolve a politically tense situation. Okay, Mussolini had already won in the election through the National Bloc a lot of positions. And the king thought he was the right man at the right time to try to resolve the crisis of Italy. So again, fascism is not something that people are like, oh, we're in fascism now. No, that's the post factum reconstruction, is that people can think of those years as the fascist years, but people living that moment were not really realizing they were entering fascism. It was just a government that was supposed to quell social distress and class conflict. And it was backed by liberals, again, as I was pointing out. And so fundamentally, why was Mussolini for me fascist? Well, because again, it started doing austerity that defeated and killed the voices of the workers. He purposefully made his government into a government that waged war against its own people. Now, what's interesting here is that he was, of course, he was doing it with castor oil because he had such a strong group of opposition in the workers. The case of Meloni is quite different, right? Because Meloni was voted on because she is suggesting a departure from austerity. If you read her program, it's a very interesting program. Electoral program. I would have voted her if she had been, you know,
even her party was very anti-NATOist, but I mean, now it seems that she has made her alignment.
NATO, she never, she knew that she couldn't have won ever if she had been against NATO, right? So this is something that since ever, the United States rule Italy and have always ruled upon Italy with all sorts of interferences. So we were the country on the line between, you know, the two blocks during the Cold War. So we've always been under control. And she knew very clearly that she can't not be anti-NATO, otherwise she wouldn't have made it. But apart from that, she made clear suggestions about redistributive policies that were much more radical than any of the supposed Democratic Party that is its opposition. The Democratic Party has been implementing austerity fundamentally since it was born in the 2000s, right? There's complete continuity. The Democratic Party defeated the workers' charter of 71, so it like flexibilized later. Draghi is in complete continuity. If you read my chapter 10, which is the conclusion, it's called Austerity Forever. I try to like trace back again. The 70s was another moment of clear class conflict in Italy, resolved again with austerity. But the point is here that the Meloni is entering a scene in which the parties of the left are austerity parties. She supposedly has been elected because people are sick of having to abide by the austerity imposed by the Troika. But what we see today is, why isn't fascism not yet? Well, because unfortunately, I'm sure, and the fact that she elected Giorgetti as Minister of Economics, who was actually in the Draghi government, makes it obvious, and she's been saying it, she's not willing to disrupt the market, the confidence of the markets. She's going to pay back the debt. She's going to start doing austerity again. And at that point, I feel, is when we will see again a resurgence of fascism, in the sense that she's going to have to enforce the hard economic pill on a population that might rebel, you know, a population that might revolt. And at that point, she will go against her own electorate, but I'm sure she won't have any trouble using the state violence and state coercion in order to do that. I mean, we've seen there's been a lot of protests in which her people have already been beating up protesters. So again, I think we will see, unfortunately, in the next couple of months, a very similar economic line as the one of Mussolini in the 1920s, for sure.
Right. One of my friends recently asked me that, what do you think about Italy? And I said that I don't know much, but it seems that they are not brown shirters marching on the street beating people. They would be more like wearing suits and coats and going to Brussels and Frankfurt and Berlin and New York and London and Washington, because that consensus is what they have come with. Yeah. And because we don't have the Occupy factory movement at this time, so beating is not even needed. Technocracy does the work for fascism, what is needed. On the British point, by the way, in India, we are seeing it's an insanity of sort of celebration about a conservative MP becoming the prime minister, because this is the first Indian to become the prime minister of a white nation, as if 200 years of colonialism was just undone by Rishi Sunak coming to power. But anyway, thank you so much for your time. This was such a pleasure. We can go on, but in the interest of your time, I'll let you go.
Thank you so much. And again, I think one point of the book is really to keep the class dimension as an important interpretative lens, and also in order to look deeper than just very superficial identity politics on who is running.
That's very refreshing.
Let's look at what's actually happening. So